Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We reserve these technical glitches for when we have a really good audience so that you can all appreciate it. Well, I'm Paddy Tillett, chair of the City Club, and I'd like to welcome you to what is certainly one of the most popular Friday forums of the year, as Governor Kitzhaber gives us his perspective on the state of the state. And it's wonderful, I might say, to have so many of you here. Thank you very much for coming and for your patience. Before I begin with other announcements, I'd like to call on board member Katie King, chair of our membership committee, for a special announcement. Katie.
Thank you, Patty. Hello, City Club and members. Do I still get 15 minutes to talk about membership? I have an important announcement today. Today marks the beginning of our membership drive. From now until the end of March, we hope to add 100 new members. On our tables, you will find tents that hold membership applications and recruitment forms. For those of you who are not yet members, we encourage you to join and become part of this dynamic organization. Please fill out the forms and send them to the City Club office. For members, I challenge each of you to recruit 2 new people for City Club before the end of March. If you have questions, please contact board members or City Club staff. And to ensure that we are off to a great beginning, I'm going to start with our head table.
Thank you. You better do as she says. She's serious. Thank you, Katie. In the coming week, club members will receive a report on affordable housing in Portland. This is the culmination of a 2-year effort by one of our research committees. And next Friday, on February the 8th, the chair of that committee will present the report and we'll vote on its adoption. This will be followed by presentations on affordable housing by Susan Emmons, who's executive director of the Northwest Pilot Project, by Stephen Rudman, who's Executive Director of the Housing Authority of Portland, and by City Commissioner Eric Sten, and that'll be here at the MAC. A reminder of what a valuable resource our website is for research, events, and membership information. Find it all at www.pdxcityclub.org. Looking ahead, on February the 15th, our program will feature a new proposal related to Portland's public school facilities. Mark Abrams, Steve Janik, and Ruth Scott will be our speakers. Our board host today is Dan Finley, at the far end of the top table here, a member of the Board of Governors and educational computer consultant. He will ask the first question of the governor. Following Dan's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience and to our friends from Lincoln High School. Delighted to see you here again. Please be ready with your questions at the microphone early. Identify yourself as a member of the City Club or of Lincoln and ask your question concisely, please. Broadcast of City programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, from Pacific Care, and from Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation. We're grateful for their support. Governor John Kitzhaber grew up in Oregon, and after high school in Eugene, went to Dartmouth College for his undergraduate degree. He came back to the UFO Medical School and some decent fly streams to complete his education. In 1980, he was elected to the first of 3 terms in the Oregon Senate and was elected Senate President 5 years later. We elected him governor in '94 and again in 1998. John Kitzhaber rose to national prominence with publication of his Oregon Health Plan. He not only wrote it, but built sufficient consensus amongst disparate interests in Salem to get it passed into law, taking effect in 1994. During his first term of governor, he oversaw the expansion of the Oregon Health Plan, reducing the rate of uninsured children in Oregon from a scandalous 21% to a more manageable 8%. His welfare reform plan, known as the Oregon Option, helped almost 20,000 Oregonians find work, halving the number of welfare cases and saving $200 million in the state budget. Along with health and welfare, education has been high on the Governor Kitzhaber's agenda. He's fought for stable education funding, implementing the Education Act for the 21st century. This has increased investment in Oregon's colleges and universities and has also stepped up juvenile crime prevention. The third realm of success is preservation of the wild places and wild fish of our state. A collaborative approach to effective conservation was implemented in his first term as governor in the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. Governor, there's a tiresome matter of a state budget to be resolved and perhaps some winter run steelhead to attend to, but we're curious as to what else lies ahead for you in your final year of office and thereafter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Governor, John Kitzhaber.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank my wife Sharon for taking the time to come down here today, and so many of my staff who I guess want to see if I can get out of here alive. It is a pleasure to be with you again today. It's also a privilege to come before you one last time to deliver the annual State of the State address. I've had the opportunity to serve in this office during unprecedented prosperity and now during very difficult economic dislocation. To have been afforded the opportunity to serve at all is a great honor, and one for which I humbly thank you. I can tell you that it's much easier to govern during good times than bad times, but I can also tell you that it is during the difficult times that we're provided the true test of our mettle and of our character and of our values. And these are indeed difficult times for Oregon. Probably the most difficult times we've had in 20 years. Indeed, there are only 5 members of the current legislature who served in the 1981-83 biennium when Oregon struggled through its last recession. Today's recession, although not as deep as the one 2 decades ago, is probably more serious because it has uncovered a fundamental flaw in a series of policy choices that we made during the 1990s. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. As you know, in the 6 years leading up to 2001, Oregon experienced record employment and economic growth. It was a very good time to be governor. It was a time of vision, a time of opportunity, a time of action. We began to implement the Education Act for the 21st century, establishing high outcome-based academic standards for our students. We expanded our community college system. We created 3 new universities and changed the funding model for higher education. Facing a growing conflict between the extraction of natural resources and long-term environmental stewardship, we devised the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, a program that's built on the voluntary efforts of industry, communities, environmental groups, and state agencies, all geared towards the common effort of watershed health and restoration. We expanded the Oregon Health Plan, giving hope to hundreds of thousands of Oregonians who, through no fault of their own, were unable to afford health care for themselves and for their families. We crafted the Oregon Children's Plan to ensure that our children get the support and the attention they need to succeed in school and to stay drug-free and to become healthy, productive adults. And the list goes on. We took the initiative in economic development, promoting Oregon business and international trade and upgrading our workforce. The Silicon Forest grew and flourished as our economy diversified, and we saw the creation of hundreds of thousands of new jobs. But as 2001 dawned, we experienced the first inklings of misplaced faith in the durability of international markets. And we began to see cracks develop in the foundations of those organizations and industries that had been built on speculation and promise rather than on production. The value of equity stocks trembled and then dipped and then nosedived. Companies, as you know, then began to lay off workers, first by the tens, then by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, leaving Oregon with the highest unemployment rate in America. And therein lies the short-term problem that we face today, an $830 million revenue shortfall due to the high unemployment rate and the increased demand for social services by people who have been laid off. The Oregon Health Plan, cash assistance, retraining efforts. I've also called, as you know, a special session for February 8th, 1 week from today, to deal with this short-term problem. But that's only part of the picture, because there's a long-term problem that we face as well. It's less obvious, perhaps, but probably much more important for Oregon's future. That challenge lies in the fact that our current level of state programs and services is not sustainable into the future based on our expected revenue projection. This discrepancy between revenues and expenditures is due largely to a series of choices that we Oregonians made in the last decade. In retrospect, if it was short-sighted to hitch our future to industries built on speculation rather than production, then it was equally short-sighted for us to delude ourselves into thinking that we could cut our taxes but not cut the programs and services that supported them. But that's exactly what we did throughout the 1990s. With Ballot Measure 5, we reduced our property taxes by over $4 billion a biennium and shifted an enormous increased responsibility for funding our school system onto the general fund. We also cut our income taxes by almost $1.5 billion through the 2% kicker, again without reducing any general fund programs. In fact, we actually increased the demands for what we expected the general fund to pay for with the passage of Ballot Measure 11 that sent Oregon down the road to a $1 billion prison construction program. So the challenge that faces Oregon today is not as simple as simply rebalancing the budget for the remainder of this biennium. The challenge is to do so in a way that not only addresses the short-term fiscal problem, but also that puts the state budget back on a sound and sustainable financial footing into the future. So the debate that's unfolding in our state has basically two questions. The first question is, how deeply should we cut current programs and services in order to help rebalance the budget? And the second question is, how should we pay for that portion of the budget that we want to preserve? And the way in which we answer these two questions will have a profound impact on what Oregon looks like in 5 years or 10 years, on what the Oregon we pass on to our children looks like. Let me start with the first question then. How deeply should we cut current programs and services in order to help rebalance the budget? As we approach this question, I think it's very important for us to recognize that to a large extent, this is a question of values. In the short term, it's about how much we value our fellow Oregonians who, through no fault of their own, find themselves without a job. I would remind you that over $87 million of our budget deficit is due to the increased demand for social support services by people who are unemployed. And I can tell you from personal experience that our unemployment figures, as stark as they are, cannot begin to express the human hardship that descends upon Oregonians when they lose the means to provide for themselves and their families. During Oregon's last recession, I was a freshman member of the Oregon State Senate. I was also a practicing emergency physician in Douglas County, where unemployment reached 22%. In my emergency room, I saw the human consequences of what happens to proud people who lose the ability to keep food on the table. Substance abuse, domestic violence, the disintegration of families. Theirs is a hardship we cannot ignore and cannot forget as we move to close the short-term budget problem facing our state. In the long term, it's about the value we place on a strong system of public education, primary and secondary and post-secondary. A system that gives all Oregonians, regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity or economic status, an equal opportunity to master the skills and command the knowledge necessary to succeed in an information-driven economy. It's about the value we place on ensuring that every child born in this state gets the help and the nurturing and the adult attention to be full participating members of and contributors to the Oregon community. And it's about the value we place on compassion, about providing a safety net to our most vulnerable citizens, our children, particularly those who are at risk, our frail elderly, the poor who cannot afford health care for themselves and their families, those with disabilities, and those who suffer from mental disorders, who, if we do not help them as a society, will end up on our streets and in our prisons. I'm not saying that there are not services and programs that we can and should cut in order to rebalance the budget. There are. But I am simply pointing out that this is not as simple as lining up numbers on a piece of paper. Behind those numbers are real people with real lives and hopes and dreams of their own. There are neighbors, our employees, our children, and our grandparents. This is not an accounting exercise. This is an exercise about values. Having spent a great deal of time working on this budget, I think that we can responsibly cut in the neighborhood of $400 million, not without consequence, but without irreparably harming the important public programs and services on which our social and economic health depend. As a counterpoint to the legislative proposal to cut $481 million, I have recommended that we reduce the state programs and services by $414 million. And even that is pushing the envelope in terms of what is responsible. My budget reduction proposal is based on 4 principles. First, to maintain our investment in education, primary and secondary education, and undergraduate post-secondary education. Second, to maintain the safety net for vulnerable citizens. Third, to maintain the public safety. And fourth, to maintain our investment in prevention. These 2 budget reduction proposals, although they are only $67 million apart, represent differences in policy and in priorities. They represent different sets of values. Nonetheless, I believe that we can and will reach consensus on the budget side of this rebalance equation. Much more problematic, however, is how we choose to pay for that part of the budget that we want to preserve, which leads us to the long-term challenge. The legislature, and let me say at this point that the legislative budget group has done an excellent job, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for moving this debate to where it is today. And I want to applaud them and the legislative leadership of both parties for the hard and diligent work that they have produced. Their financing proposal relies on 14 sources of revenue to generate $348 million. I have a number of serious objections to several of those sources because they violate a very simple principle: pay as you go. 2 of these revenue sources tap into existing trust funds, the Common School Fund and the Healthcare Trust Funds. Now, these are trust funds, and the operative word here is trust. These funds were created to build a principle from which interest could be derived to provide long-term sustainable funding for very specific purposes. The Healthcare Trust Fund was created, for example, with proceeds from the National Tobacco Settlement. The revenue was to provide a source of funding for health-related programs, smoking cessation and prevention, or providing health care services for the working poor. The Common School Fund was established when Oregon became a state 143 years ago. It was designed to build a principle to provide an ongoing source of revenue for primary and secondary education in the state of Oregon. To me, raiding these funds or borrowing from these funds to address a short-term budget problem is simply irresponsible. And I think we have to be very clear that the only reason these measures are being considered in the first place is to give political cover to some legislators, certainly not all, but some legislators of both parties who don't have the courage to raise taxes nor the will to cut the programs that those taxes support. Let me tell you how the argument goes. If you are a Republican, you are in control of the legislature and you want to stay in control of the legislature, so you can't possibly vote to raise taxes or make deep cuts in programs for the elderly or for schools because you might lose the election. If you're a Democrat, you're not in control and you want to become in control, so you can't possibly raise taxes or cut programs for education or for senior citizens because you might lose the election. So what do? Well, you try to find a way to balance the budget without raising taxes or without making deep and politically controversial cuts. And how do you do that? You do it by raiding trust funds, by borrowing against the future, or resorting to accounting tricks. Now, I approach this budget challenge from a very simple and straightforward premise. If we want to protect programs in the face of the budget deficit, then we need to pay for them. Not by borrowing, not by stealing money from trust funds established for other purposes, not through accounting maneuvers, but with real revenue options. And as you know, I have proposed some real revenue options. I've proposed repealing, or at least delaying, the implementation of Ballot Measure 88, a tax cut that has not yet gone into effect yet, and which will benefit primarily those at the upper end of the income scale. I have suggested increasing the current tax on tobacco to help pay for health care. And I have suggested increasing the beer and wine tax to help pay for mental health and drug and alcohol treatment programs. I would point out that I am not alone in this nation in arguing that additional revenue is required to meet the legitimate needs of state governments, nor that this is not the time to implement tax cuts. 4 Republican governors, including Governor Jeb Bush of Florida, have recommended delaying tax cuts. 3 Republican governors have actually recommended tax increases, and others are considering them. My proposal not only brings us back into balance for the current biennium and slightly expands our ending balance, but it also reduces the projected budget shortfall in 03-05 from $1 billion down to about $240 million. This proposal will preserve our commitment to education, to vulnerable citizens, and to public safety, and it will put the state budget back on a sound and sustainable footing without borrowing, without raiding trust funds, and without engaging in accounting maneuvers. By contrast, the financing proposal being advanced in Salem is to a large extent a continuation of the short-sighted policies of the 1990s by which we deluded ourselves into believing that we could cut our taxes, yet still maintain and even expand the programs that those taxes support. I'm not just talking about Ballot Measure 5 or the 2% kicker. I'm talking about a mindset that recognized the need for additional services in the state budget, but lacked the political will and fiscal discipline to pay for them with existing revenues. In the 1997 session and in the 1999 session, if you recall, I argued that we should take some of the income generated by our strong, robust economy and use it to help finance our educational system. I lost that fight. Now, the legislature did not disagree with the need for more money in education. They simply didn't want to pay for it. So instead, they sent $420 million of surplus revenue back through the 2% kicker, and then turned around and borrowed $277 million financed with lottery-backed bonds to finance K through 12. Now, that money was spent in those 4 years. It's all gone. But we're going to be paying the debt service on those bonds for 15 years at a total cost to the taxpayers of $412 million, almost as much as we sent back through the 2% kicker. I just don't think it's responsible to continue those kinds of policies, nor to rely on existing trust funds to blur the very real relationship between tax dollars and the programs and services that those tax dollars support. And I don't believe it's responsible to bridge our current budget problem by taking payments that are due this biennium and moving them into the next biennium. And I'm referring to the proposal under consideration in some quarters to take the last $211 million K through 12 payment and make it due on July 1st so it falls in the next biennium, not this biennium. That amounts to a $211 billion cut in the K through 12 budget for 01-03 with no guarantee that the next legislature is going to come up with the money. In a very real sense, it puts education last, and it continues the practice of making tough political decisions someone else's problem. We have an opportunity to end that practice. We have an opportunity to be accountable to Oregonians and indeed to ourselves for the dollars we spend and for the programs and services that those dollars can realistically be expected to support over time, and to put our state budget and finances back on a sound, sustainable footing for the future. You know, I've been around long enough to be able to appreciate some historic symmetry about our current situation here. 10 years ago, in the ruins of the special session in July of 1992, called by Governor Roberts to find replacement revenue for Ballot Measure 5, a joint press statement was issued. Among other things, this statement said, and I quote, "We have no intention of leaving unaddressed the fiscal problems created by the passage of Ballot Measure 5. We do not question the necessity of replacement revenue to responsibly provide for the legitimate needs of our state. And while there remains some debate and concern about the magnitude of the revenue needed, and the way it should be allocated, we are committed to reaching a bipartisan and bicameral consensus on both issues in a timely and effective fashion. Interestingly enough, then TV reporter, now Representative Mark Hass, did a story on this press release. Even more interesting are the names on it. My name is Senate President, House Speaker Larry Campbell, hardly a tax and spend liberal. Then House Majority Leader, now U.S. Congressman Greg Walden. Then House Minority Leader, now State Senator Peter Courtney. Gene Timms as Senate Minority Leader, and then Senate Majority Leader and now Secretary of State Bill Bradbury. Now, my point in sharing this with you is simply this. There was a clear and bipartisan recognition that you cannot increase the demand on the general fund to the extent that Ballot Measure 5 did and still expect the same level of state programs and services without some replacement revenue. Now, unfortunately, the bipartisan agreement forged by the legislative leadership 10 years ago was never implemented because the fact that our fiscal policy was unsustainable was masked by the growing economy and by the addition of revenue from video poker. You know, I have been reminded more than once in the last few weeks of the passage by T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Well, we have been here before, and we have an opportunity to address now what we recognized and failed to address 10 years ago. My friends, the challenge facing Oregon is not as simple as a choice between taxes and budget cuts. And we will do ourselves a great disservice to ourselves, to our children, and to our posterity if we allow the mindless ideology of the talk show host to be substituted for a thoughtful discussion about Oregon's future. The challenge facing us today is not so much about budget cuts and tax hikes. It's a question of accountability. The accountability to provide stable financing for those state programs and services that we think are important, that reflect our values, that we want to define us as Oregonians, both now and in the future. And if those programs and services aren't important enough to pay for without borrowing, without raiding trust funds, without resorting to accounting tricks, then we should cut them. It's as simple as that. Cutting deeper is certainly an option. It is one choice that we have to balance this budget. But make no mistake about it, it is also a choice for a different kind of Oregon than the one we know today. It is, after all, our commitment to each other and our communities, to our children and to education, to caring for vulnerable citizens and for our natural environment that makes Oregon's definition of civic responsibility and quality of life different than that of Texas or of some other state. That is very important to me, and I hope that it's important to you as well, because that's really what we're talking about here. 200 years ago, Lewis and Clark had the undaunted courage to take up President Jefferson's challenge to go into the unknown and find the Northwest Passage. And at the end of their journey, they found Oregon, this special and, to me, most wonderful place on the face of the earth. Well, this place is ours now. It's our blessing, and it's our responsibility. And we, too, need to find the courage to ensure its bright future. Thank you.
Governor Kitzhaber, taking a look at the economic experiences we've had over the last few years and the really, quite frankly, short-sightedness and greed that has gripped the way that we've dealt with financial issues, a change of pace is definitely going to be in order. Something needs to change. One way that we can increase revenues in the state is to get more business into the state and bring more people in from the outside. Oregon is a great place to live, and it will be, again, a great place to work. I have a question, and it's not quite what people think it may be, but rather when we don't educate and guarantee a strong comprehensive education for all students from K up through graduate school, how many corporations are going to be willing to locate in the state of Oregon and take a chance on a workforce that may not be top drawer?
Well, I think when corporations want to come to Oregon, the first question they ask is not how high your cigarette tax is. They probably ask, they ask about the primary and secondary school system. They ask about the system of community colleges and higher education. They're incredibly important. And all of us for 20 years, and particularly in the last 10 years, since we adopted the Education Act for the 21st century to establish very high standards for our public school system, have essentially paid lip service to the importance of education and the particular importance to education beyond high school, to be a full productive member of the economy and of our society. And we were able to fulfill that commitment to some extent during the last 10 years because of the good economy. But we also need to remember that tuition at our post-secondary schools went up 80% in the 1980s because of that, in the 1990s because of that cost shift. Now we have the opportunity again to really, I think, put our money where our mouth is, and it is an investment. I will simply tell you that I was over in Prineville the other day, and someone from Les Schwab was telling me that this is a high-tech company, that they have to have people working in that country that are computer literate, and that post-secondary education is a must for that industry. So that is our future, and we have to step up to it and assume that responsibility both in the short term and in the long term.
Jay Formick, City Club member. Governor Kitzhaber, I'm going to miss our annual meetings. You stated you were humbled and proud to serve as our governor. I am very proud to have had you as our governor. Thank you very much. Last year, you told us the stories of two different individuals, and it was a way of introducing the children's agenda. As a way of illustrating how the system in Salem works, for those of us who find it Byzantine and ununderstandable, can you tell us where that agenda wound up and what it's facing now with the current crisis?
The children's plan was passed with very broad bipartisan support, both houses, both chambers, financed with almost its full budget, around $60 million. Which gave us the resources to, on a voluntary basis, screen every firstborn child in Oregon for risk factors that can later lead to school failure and dropout and involvement in the criminal justice system, as well as medical risk factors, and to provide them the supports and services in the community to help those families. It is in the process of being implemented. In my recommended budget level, it is kept fairly intact. It just seems to me that if we're serious about education, and we want to reduce the cost of a primary and secondary school system, then you've got to reduce the number of damaged kids that come in the front door, and it costs pennies to do that, and this is not the time to turn our back on at-risk children. The legislative proposal makes about a 16% cut in the children's plan.
Governor, Greg McPherson, City Club member. Among the failures of the past decade fiscally in this state was the failure to implement an economic security fund, sometimes commonly referred to as a rainy day fund. How would you propose that we accomplish that when we return to good times, which would seem to be the time when we should set money aside for the inevitable downturn?
Well, this is not a new idea. I actually tried to get, if you recall, a school stabilization fund on the ballot through the initiative process in 2000, but had to give up those efforts to help lead the campaign against Ballot Measure 91. I'm introducing another bill to establish a rainy day fund for schools. Again, it would be very similar to the one I recommended before. It would be capitalized up to 10% of the general fund. It could be accessed just to maintain current service levels in our educational system, and would require a 3/5 vote of the legislature and a referral to the voters to actually access it to prevent what's being contemplated for the Common School Fund from happening to this body. The tricky thing is how you capitalize it. So moving farther out the road of controversy, I actually suggested a way to do that. There's 15% of the lottery fund that currently is dedicated to what's called the Education Endowment Fund, and we would essentially make that into the stabilization fund. We would add to that any lottery proceeds in excess of $600 million into the future, so increased lottery activities to help capitalize it. And then I proposed a 1% real estate transfer tax that exempts the first $100,000 of value. The point here isn't the mechanism you use, but if you set up a rainy day fund and don't have the will to create a mechanism to actually capitalize it, you haven't done your job. So I'm open to other alternatives in the real estate transfer tax, but if we don't want to simply repeat the tough choices we're making now and had to make 20 years ago, the next time the economy cycles, we'd best set up the fund now and figure out how to get some money into it.
Linda Hathaway Bunza. I'm director of the Columbia Research Institute for the Arts and Humanities and a City Club member. I'm glad you didn't quote another part of T.S. Eliot about how our culture could become a wasteland. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We have a very rich and wonderful culture. And what I was going to ask is, to what extent in your budget equation are you having to deal with problems of homeland security and providing protection to the state? How difficult is that for you to maintain what you're doing in your budget work?
Since September 11th, we've done a number of things. We've created a Security Council and also an Office of Public Safety and Security within the Department of State Police. We were loaning some state police officers to the Port of Portland for a while, which was an additional impact on our general fund, but the cost has not been excessive, and there are significant federal dollars actually starting to flow in right now to supplement both state and local efforts to maintain homeland security. So that's not really, I think, going to be an issue. I thought maybe you're going to refer to that quote, T.S. Eliot's quote, that they were a harmless people. They're only monuments, the asphalt road, and 1,000 lost golf balls. But
Steve Novak, City Club member. Governor, first of all, with Paul Romaine seated to my right, I feel compelled to suggest you consider taxing luxury cars instead of cheap beer. My question, however, is this. As has been remarked in times past, the legislators have jobs and homes and campaigns to get back to. You live there, you work there, you're not running for anything. That, in my view, gives you almost dictatorial power. You've been known as a conciliator.
if only it were true.
You've been known as a conciliator, but there's a time for peace and there's a time for war. And many of us want to know, are you prepared to use that power and hold your cowboy-booted foot on their collective throats?
You gotta love that guy, you know? Well, just a couple of comments. I take exception with the view that making tough political choices on budget cuts or taxes is political death in this state. I remember in 1981 special session, I didn't vote for the tax cut. It was called being protected by the leadership. I was from Douglas County, so they took a couple of us. They had the votes. Said, "Now, don't you vote for this?" And it never felt very right to me. And I never did it again. And as many of you recall, I went and not only crafted but went out and campaigned for the sales tax in 1985. That only lost 4-1 and got reelected by 60% from Douglas County. And I've talked about the kicker, and I've talked to you about taxes before, and I've been elected as governor twice. It doesn't mean people agree with me. But I think we undersell Oregonians if we think they aren't sophisticated enough to figure out how to connect the dots. And I think what they want is people to take a position and go out and defend it. And they'll agree with them or disagree with them, but they don't kick them out of office for having the courage to stand on their convictions. So that's point one. The second point is, I don't think this is about war. The legislature is a very wonderful institution. I was part of it for 14 years. We've got very good people down there. And I think that we need to create a framework which forces some choices, some explicit choices about what we want. And you have a role and responsibility to help them, to give them permission, to tell them that that's what you want them to do and that's what you expect them to do.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Governor, our country and state have the most automobiles of any developed country in the world, and yet we have the lowest gas tax. And we use it to help people drive more. The European community, on the other hand, have probably the highest gas tax, and it's credited to the general fund. It pays for everything. Now, I think we as Oregonians pride ourselves in being different, certainly different from the rest of the country. Isn't it time that we made a choice to use the gas tax either as a replacement for revenues in the general fund or as a minimum to make it available to any kind of transportation projects, including those that reduce driving and help reduce pollution and give us choices? Which one do you think?
Well, I don't think that the gas tax is probably going to be the transportation financing revenue source of the future. As you know, as cars get more efficient, you produce less revenue with each gallon. So I think we're going to have to try to broaden the base of funding for transportation infrastructure because you depend on it whether you drive or not. If you're bedridden, the ambulance comes to your house on it. I mean, that's how the groceries get down to, Zupan's or Kmart or wherever you happen to shop. But I do believe that it is archaic to continue the constitutional dedication of the Transportation Fund only to traditional highway projects. It creates this kind of an inconsistency. If you have commuter traffic that's creating a congestion problem, the highway fund will let you spend $30 million adding a commuter lane, but not $900,000 to add a commuter bus that could alleviate the problem for that investment in the first place. So at the very least, we ought to open up the transportation fund or a piece of it to finance alternative transportation to give people other options than single occupancy vehicle driving. Another idea whose time has not yet come, I assure you.
Hi, my name is Aisha Khan, and I go to Lincoln High School. And I was wondering what you thought of the student-run rally yesterday in Pioneer Courthouse Square and what impact it will have on the budget. And also, what priority do you see education in the budget this year?
Well, I think that the rally was tremendous. I think any time students get involved in taking hold of an issue and expressing their views on something that's going to affect their future, it's commendable, and we should encourage it, and we should thank you very much for your willingness to be involved. Clearly, education, I think, will probably be the top priority, given the fact that it's the single largest chunk of the general fund. But I guess the only place I might differ with the rally is that education is not just K through 12. Education has to be viewed as investments in early childhood at-risk kids so they can actually take advantage of it. Education has to be viewed as community colleges and our universities. And we can't allow ourselves to get into a situation where we segment up the education continuum and have higher ed fighting with community colleges, fighting with K through 12, fighting with human resource programs. We all ought to be pushing together for equitable, balanced funding of the entire education continuum.
Good afternoon, Governor. Diane Lynn, City Club member, Chair of the County Board of Commissioners. Would you believe I hired Steve Novick, and he holds me to that standard every day, so...
Why would you do something like that?
We all need the courage. Governor, my question is, as we speak right now, I understand that the Emergency Board is cutting or proceeding ahead with delayed eligibility for the Oregon Health Plan, which seems on its face to be an easy place to find money. The problem is when people come out of jail or out of facilities, if they have to wait a month, we lose their ability to make sure they stay on their meds and stabilize them. They're also cutting babies first, as we understand as of this morning. So do you think they have the unilateral ability to do that? It's going to cost us a lot more money because they'll cycle right back through our system, as we know. The local level, we're kind of downstream of all of this. Do you think there's hope to bring that kind of thing back as your proposal? And we strongly support, emphatically support all of what you said today. It makes too much sense. We wish logic would prevail in Salem. Do you think we can restore that kind of cut?
Well, I think the debate over the Department of Human Service budget will definitely spill over into the special session. And I think that, you know, one of the things that a lot of people don't, I think, still appreciate, even though we've had a 10-year debate on health care in this state that's probably way ahead of what most other states have had, is denying people coverage for health care doesn't keep them out of the hospital. We have a de facto policy of universal access in this country. It's called the federal law that prevents you from doing a Blue Cross biopsy, a wallet biopsy on someone if it's Blue Cross negative, leaving him to die in the ambulance ramp. It's against the law in this country. If they go to the hospital and they're sick, you take them in, and then they'll show up for a treatment of a stroke rather than for management of their blood pressure. We won't pay to manage their blood pressure in the community, but we'll resuscitate them with their stroke in the hospital at hundreds of times the cost, and then the business community that provides health care for their employees picks up that cost through a cost shift. And you're absolutely right. We need to continue to try to make the point that we certainly can't provide coverage for everyone, but to the extent that we can expand some basic level of coverage to people in this state, it costs us less money, and it is a much more humane thing to offer our fellow citizens access to primary and preventive care rather than emergency care in the hospital.
John Milt Markowitz from City Club. Nice to see you again. 2 years ago when you spoke, you started and ended your speech with the notion that we really needed a message that transcended the issues that we were talking about and took us out of our past and into a future we wanted. And there was a suggestion that we use the Progress Board's work that defined who we wanted to be in 50 years as a way of shaping a shared vision for ourselves. And the notion out of that was, well, the Progress Board work didn't work because although it made us wealthier in some ways, we didn't invest out of that wealth, and we should have. And my sense was that perhaps we didn't because we didn't have the message. We didn't have that clear sense of where we wanted to go and that we could get there if we invested in it. And I think also today when I listen to you, this is a matter of values now. A lot of what you're asking for is us to live by our values. And so I want to ask you again today, what might we do to use that work of the Progress Board, or what are we doing to create that shared vision for ourselves, create that sense of investment, wanting to invest, and bringing our values to the fore?
Well, I think if you recall, when the Progress Board was created, it was created under the Goldschmidt administration. At the same time, we created this concept of the circle of prosperity. And what we did in the 1980s is we uncoupled the circle of prosperity. There's one little piece that said you have a good, thriving economy that generates tax resources, which are reinvested in the education system, et cetera, et cetera. And with the 2% kicker, which is now in our Constitution, we've disconnected the ability to reinvest during good times. I think we need to continue to talk about that in particular, or find another way to invest during good times to make sure that we can actually build a sustainable future. But I also think that, and I made just a reference to it at the end of my speech, but I really do think that we need to be much more aggressive and vocal at the community level, in community forums, in our newspapers, and on the radio, because we are abandoning the field of battle to people who have sound clips, who follow ideology, and a lot of it has to do with radio talk shows, which are not particularly substantive. And I think that we have to engage in a much more aggressive effort to become civically involved here. The kids, this is a great example. It shouldn't just be kids filling up Pioneer Square about cuts to education. It should be all of us. Uh-oh. Another tough student question coming up here.
I'm Elise Hope from Oregon Episcopal School, and our federal government seems to be moving in a direction that's pushing towards all children by the age of 12 being able to read, write, and do mathematics. And they propose to enforce this by doing more testing. What is your take on this?
Well, I don't have any problem with the testing, but you have to provide the fundamental resources to ensure that schools have the ability to give the kids the tools they need to pass the test. And my concern is that we're spending huge amounts of money on a whole lot of things right now, if you look at the budget, but it's not nearly the amount of money we ought to actually be spending in the classroom on education. Testing's fine, but if you're not willing to step up and fund the teachers, to get the class sizes down, to provide them with adequate textbooks, access to technology, they're not going to pass the test.
Governor Joe Smith, City Club, but I'm wanting the City Club staff to listen very closely and Patty to listen very closely because this is sort of a question for Patty. A year ago, I went home from this occasion and told my spouse, you had just made the best speech I'd ever heard you make. And both of us sat down and emailed everybody we knew in Oregon and told them when your speech would be on television over the next 2 days and urged all of those people to watch. In this room, there are probably access via email to 10,000 Oregonians. Before we leave, could we be told when it's going to run on television in the next 48 hours so everyone here can go home, access their email, and say, you really need to listen to what the governor had to say?
So Joe, you're the guy that got the children's plan passed last year.
We have time for one more question, and staff, I would love to have that information in case I get it wrong.
I'm Jacob Riesberg from Oregon Episcopal School, and I'm very privileged to be at a private school because the budget does not directly affect me. But when I go home to my neighborhood and I'm speaking with my friends about what it's like in their public schools, and I hear them telling me how their music classes are getting more and more crowded, and their debate team was just cut because of insufficient funds. I'm wondering what specific things can be done about targeting certain areas in public schools.
Oh, that's a tough question. I think the basic problem we've got in our primary and secondary school system in Oregon today, we've got a number of problems. We've basically, in real dollars, the budget hasn't been expanding. If you look at sort of the budget cuts following Measure 5, we've got a significant increase in the number of kids in those school buildings. If you go into a lot of communities, the best-looking building's the hospital, not the public school. And so we've got deferred maintenance issues, and we've also got a lot of teachers that are about ready to retire. And it's going to be a really huge challenge, and I don't believe that it can be that it's a matter of really targeting a specific area. I think it's basically continuing this chronic debate, the holy grail of every governor, to figure out a way to provide adequate long-term funding for our schools. I will say in closing that we've got a better chance today to close the loop on that than we've ever had before, and that is because of both the Education Act of the 21st century and the Quality Education Commission that begins to put a price tag on how much it actually costs to achieve the outcomes that we want. And if we stay the course on those two things through the next administration, whoever that governor may be, I believe we'll be able to answer that question and get that funding source we need for a strong primary and secondary system in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Governor Kitzhaber, that was an outstanding speech, as always. You haven't besmirched your reputation one little bit. The applause was long enough for me to get the information that I need, which is to tell you that Oregon Public Broadcasting tonight, the time is to be announced. Portland Cable Access at 8 o'clock tonight and on Tuesday, and that's on Channel 30. Chat on City Club website by 5 o'clock tonight, and that, as you all will have engraved in your hearts, is www.pdxcityclub.org. Thank you, Governor, very much indeed. We're adjourned.